p.m. Please stand for the pledge of allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, do I have a motion to adopt the agenda? The amended agenda.
I'll make a motion to adopt the amendment.
I'll second the motion.
Motion made and seconded, those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Hang down for a little bit. Public comment period. Citizens may address the council on items on the agenda or not on the agenda. Out of respect for the council and others in attendance, please limit your comment to 3 minutes. Please state your name and address for the record. Do you have any public comments? Yes, ma'am.
So, my name is Mike Cuff, and I live over on Burt Street. I just wanted to bring it to the councilor's attention. I have a really difficult time with graffiti. I moved here 11 years ago, and one of the first things that the boys and I did was we went around town, identified graffiti, and then we found the property owner, asked if it was going to be okay to go and paint over it, and we did. You know, it was not a big deal. That particular property that you see down there is down by Staub's refueling station down by the railroad tracks. I know that on the Brown building, that stuff has been there for over 30 days. On the back side of that, which is now the back side of Pro Build, there's some additional graffiti that is new to me. So my concern is do we have an ordinance or something that says, let's get this crap off the walls, and if so, who does it? You know, is it the property owner's responsibility? You know, if we have like a youth organization or something that's looking for some community service time to be able to paint over it, whatever. But I'll tell you, coming into this town, seeing that crap, it just tears me up.
I have property right next to this, mine.
Okay.
I have the mini storages there.
Okay.
My in-laws. We tried to pressure wash this off, and it's on there pretty good. And the property owner, their real estate agent was up here about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
They are aware of this.
Okay.
I don't know what they're gonna do about it.
Well, so how do we hold our feet to the fire?
They said they'll take it back to the owner, and
And how much time do they have to respond?
I have to look and see what the.
Could we do that?
Yes.
I tell you, I moved, one of the reasons I moved to this town when I was checking it out a long time ago was that I didn't see any graffiti.
Mhm.
You know, that tells me there was community involvement. There are people that give a darn about living here, that the police force was able to go and have some teeth. And seeing this kind of stuff, I mean, it just tears me up. So I thought I'd bring it to the council's attention.
And it's also been brought to the police department too. They've talked to several people about this
Okay.
already.
Okay, so I had it, you got it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay,
Thank you, Mike. Is anybody else? Yeah, Dick.
I'm Jake Greer, the Director of our Community Justice Adult Juvenile Probation. Now this is in regards to the housing there with the McGarvis. I know there were some concerns about rapists and murderers living on site that are on supervision. In all my years of doing this job, I've never allowed anyone convicted of a person-to-person crime or crimes against children in any form or fashion to occupy transition housing or housing developments. We have a separate place for those folks to reside if they need be. So I just wanted to clear the air for that and for the council that those folks will not be living there.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks, Dick. Anybody else? Hearing none, we'll move into old business. Proposal for the town to sell the 13 acres of Red Rock. That's all been taken care of.
Yeah, there's a draft sales agreement to Red Rock. They are having to run it past their legal counsel and their bond counsel. So we're waiting on that. They're also working, the city engineer is working on the legal description and dimensions of what's actually the pixel. We have the price range we discussed at the last hearing in there, and however many acres it turns out to be for what they need for the facility, that's what it's going to end up as. Red Rock just wants to make sure they have adequate for what they're going to use, and I know that town's going to be okay with that as far as going on there. The other issue is we also are waiting, there's some right of ways to be established, so those will be established via a reservation in the deed that goes from town to Red Rock once the sales agreement is approved, so that will be part of that process as well, just for access for our property, and then for some of the equipment and stuff that'll be in common with both facilities. So it's on track, we're just waiting to hear from them, and like I said, they've got 2 other sets of lawyers looking at it, so it's taking some time, but they do have a draft.
So we're on hold, pending right now.
Yes.
The next one is the public hearing considering ordinance number 776, amending the comprehensive plan map, zoning map of application 739, remanded back to the planning commission. All right. So the public hearing on quasi judicial land application is scheduled for tonight. Oregon law requires that I make several announcements for this hearing. A staff report has been prepared for the application, and the staff report was available 7 days before tonight's hearing. The staff report identifies the approval criteria that apply to the applicant's proposed development and analysis those criteria. A copy of the rules of procedure for the hearing, agenda for tonight's hearing, and copies of the staff report are available at the entrance in the back of the room. All these in attendance are asked to sign the attendance sheet, and please include your address. Testimony and evidence from all concerned shall be specific to the applicable criteria and standards. Testimony also should not be repetitive. Please do not repeat testimony offered by yourself or earlier witnesses. Also, please refrain from demonstrations such as applause, cheering, or other disruptions which are prohibited. Any person wishing a continuance to present additional evidence and testimony to keep the record open to respond to new evidence must make that request before the public testimony portion of the hearing is closed. If the council makes a decision you disagree with, any issue you want to raise on an appeal has to have been raised for the council's consideration. Failure to have raised an issue on the record with sufficient specifically and accompanied by statements of evidence sufficient to have afforded the council and the parties of this proceeding to respond to that issue will prelude appeal on that issue to the Land Use Board of Appeals. Failure of the applicant to raise additional or other issues relating to the proposed condition or approval was sufficient specifically to allow the council to respond to the issue preludes an action for damages in circuit court. All persons testifying at this hearing must recognize by the chair, approach the podium, and state your name and address. We will now open record for Lakeview file number 739, request for plan zone amendments from residential to multifamily residential property located at 207 North L. I will ask council members to disclose any ex parte contacts, conflicts of interest, bias, or any other statement to declare. Has any council member visited the site? Does anyone in the audience wish to question any of the council members about these disclosures? The procedure we will follow for this hearing set out in the state law and the Lakeview Development Code is as follows. Each item will begin with the applicant, who has the burden of proof, and his or her representative will make an introductory statement, including testimony as to why the proposal and other relief should be granted. The applicant or representative will be allowed up to 20 minutes. The town attorney and any other town, state, county, or federal agencies' comments will be presented. Persons who are present and support the application will be heard next. Individuals will be allowed up to 3 minutes. Correspondent in support of the application will be entered in the record. Persons who are present and who oppose the application will then be heard. Individuals will be allowed up to 3 minutes. Correspondent in opposition to the application will be entered into the record. For persons who are neutral but have questions, they will come next. Individuals will be allowed up to 3 minutes. The applicant is given the final result, at which time the public hearing will be closed. Members of the council and town attorney may direct questions to the applicant or opponents to assist at arriving at a decision. The council will make a decision or continue its deliberations to another time and place.
So I believe the applicant has given a letter of July 25th, 2020, requesting a continuance. So there is a request on the floor, Mr. Chair, Mayor, for that. So it is the council's pleasure whether or not to entertain that at this time, although by law you have to. No, it was made before.
Based on the foregoing, the applicant's request that the town council open the public hearing in this matter and adopt the following motion at its meeting on July 28, 2020. The town moves to reopen the public hearing for the garbage zone change, application 739, for property located at 207 North L Street, based on the letter submitted by applicants council on July 23, 2020, raising concerns about procedural irregularities on the following terms. The town council opens the public hearing and instructs city staff to prepare a quasi-judicial land use notice to be sent to the local newspaper and city's notice list to no later than 14 days prior to the special meeting to be set for August 26, 2020 at 5 p.m. The town council further continues the public hearing to a special meeting of the town council on August 26, 2020 at 5 p.m. to be held at Memorial Hall.
We need a second. We need a second that, I second that.
Yeah, motion, you have a motion, okay, I need a second. You second that?
Yep.
So, those in favor?
I
Aye. Okay, let's move on down to new business. Chief Mark Meeker, 911 dispatch update, consultation work. Up to you, Chief.
Thank you. You wanna just plug this in, or you wanna go there, or we wanna do the show?
we can do that.
Plug that in here. That's an HDMI.
Mr. Mayor, you need to, because you continued, you need to close the public hearing. No,
Oh, I'm
close-
sorry.
No, excuse me, you did not, you continued it, so you're fine. So,
See what we're doing now.
Conference will now be recorded.
There's a never-ending loop of recording.
What was the date of that next meeting?
26th.
August
August
26,
26th.
5 p.m. at Memorial Hall.
Michelle, by the way, the applicant's attorney indicated she wasn't able to log in for some reason.
It's working now, it's okay.
Okay, that's a good I needed anyway. Okay, hello, everybody. I'm gonna stay 6 feet away and just breathe for a minute here. My name is Mark Beaker. I've been hired by the city to come in as a consultant. With me as an associate consultant, Chuck Redan. Most of you on the council know me now and have met me, but your audience has not, so we want to be aware of what we have. My company does operations, human resources, labor relations, organizational development, leadership development. Myself, educationally, I have a master's degree in public administration, human resource management, a bachelor's degree in journalism and communications, associate's degree in fire technology and general education. And I have a 400-hour and 10 exam California State Certified Fire Chief Officer certificate. I was last the fire chief of North Bend, Oregon. Before that, I was fire chief in Logan City, Utah. I was fire chief at Casunas Fire, and I worked from 1971 to 1997 as an assistant chief for Sac Metro. I started as a volunteer, and then a firefighter, a lieutenant captain, battalion chief, and assistant chief. So I've been in the fire service from August of 71 until I retired, or in 71 until 2019 when I retired to take care of my 95-year-old dad, who finally needed somebody. So I'm living in Boise now, trying to deal with big cities. And I do consulting work on the side. So I received a call. I've known Michelle for 30 years. She knew me when I was fire chief in Elk Grove, California, Casunas. In fact, I taught her children how to swim, and my daughters babysat her kids, and including the kid who's a teacher at the high school now, so not to ages there, Michelle. But she asked me if I could be of some help, and so I agreed to do it. And the first thing that I want to make very clear is it's very important to get the tasking right. When I was fire chief in Elk Grove, I was approached by the county sheriff of Sacramento County, and they had, this is as the year 2000 changeover, the millennial change was coming, they had a terrorist threat against 2 suburban propane tanks, which if you've ever driven through Sacramento and gone down Highway 99, these huge tanks are visible as you pass through Elk Grove. They're nicknamed the Twin Sisters. They each hold 12 million gallons of liquefied petroleum gas, and actually propane. And if you know anything about hazardous materials, the expansion ratio from liquid to gas is 700 times. So if you take 24 million liquid gallons of propane and multiply it times 700, that's how much explosive proof or explosion potential you have. To put that into different perspective, propane has a flammability range of 1.8 to 12%, with the highest bang for the buck at the center point between the too lean and too rich, so about 6% gives you the biggest bang. That's the kind of explosion that if you have one in a house, instead of blowing windows out, it turns the house into toothpicks. So take 6% of 24 million liquid gallons times 700 for cubic feet of gas, and then you only need 6% of that to reach the biggest bang for the buck. It's equivalent to a 2 megaton nuclear explosion, according to the Lawrence Livermore Lab. So that was a big deal. So they brought me into it. It was the anti-terrorism task force that brought me into it. And the FBI was involved in it. And the FBI, without consulting with firefighters who know something about this kind of thing, said to Lawrence Livermore Lab, what is the megaton equivalent in a nuclear weapon of this commodity of product? And it came back a 2 megaton nuclear bomb, and it had a blast radius with everything wiped out for 5 miles, and heavy destruction for 10 miles, and substantial burns and broken windows and radiation sickness for 25-mile diameter. The problem with that is the FBI didn't task it correctly to the Lawrence Livermore Lab. And it was, that answer was an incorrect answer. It was a correct answer to the tasking, but the tasking was wrong, because that's not the way gas blows up. These knucklehead terrorists were planning on using some RPGs to attack the tanks at midnight as we changed to the year 2000 to make some political statement. And it would have exploded and busted a hole in both tanks, and that would have poured out into the containment lagoons, and then that would come out as liquid, which would then begin immediately boiling off as a vapor. and it would be way, way, way too rich to explode. And so it would spread until it eventually leaned out to 6% to 12% to 1.8%, and then it would find an ignition source, because propane is heavier than air, unlike natural gas. But it wouldn't go bang, it would go fluff, because it's going to either be too rich or too lean when it catches an ignition source. Now, if it were to catch that ignition source with an air-fuel mixture of 6 and it was confined, then it would be a bang, like a nuclear explosion. So it wigged everybody out, as you can imagine. And they ended up, Suburban Propane bringing in their PhDs, and then Lawrence Livermore Lab brought their PhDs down. It became a real cluster, if you know what I'm saying. And the whole thing could have been handled properly had it been tasked right from the beginning. If the FBI would have actually, and I love the FBI, so law enforcement here, you know, 2 things cops and firefighters have in common, besides the fact that we both want to be firefighters, right, is that we respect the FBI and what they do. They're wonderful people. But they didn't task it through us, and so consequently it put us really off. And we got back on track, and the FBI brought in a tactical team from wherever their nearest FBI equivalent SWAT team, and they found the location of the terrorists, and they made an assault on it and took them down without incident. And that was that. But I learned in that experience that it's important to task things right to begin with. So one of the things we ask, or I ask out front, is this a top to bottom review of the fire department and dispatch? Or is it focused on several specific areas? Or just one monofocused area? And the direction came back that we wanted a top to bottom analysis. And so the actual language in the hiring contract says fire service consulting for the town, functions pertaining to operations, HR, labor relations, and to the state attorney walked out. We don't cross into labor relations without conferring with them. We've been involved in many contract negotiations. We understand how that works. Leadership and organizational development apply to all divisions and aspects of the fire department and dispatch 911. They gave us an hour investigation budget of 100 hours to do the investigation and develop. Because Michelle's a friend, I told her, she goes, I can't afford a lot of money, so what do I get as a discount? I said, you get the Mark Meeker, Michelle Perry discount. Well, what's that mean when we hit that 100 hours? Because we'll blow through that very quickly. So far, the final report, which is still under construction, is 4 inches thick. Most of it is reference material, and it'll be very well summarized with executive summaries, so I don't want anybody to have a heart attack here. And I don't get paid by the weight of the binder, by the way. But we've already hit that, so everything I do from this point forward is free gratis. It's a gift to the town. I like this quotation because the first thing Michelle told me is, she said, now I want you to give results to the council at our meeting. And I said, well, actually, the first thing she said is, we don't have a lot of problems. It's not leadership. It's just little things. And I said, no, you're absolutely wrong. It's always leadership. You have problems. It doesn't matter where they're at in the organization. It's always leadership. And then she says, I want you to be prepared to tell them what's wrong at this meeting coming up at the end of the month. I said, no, that's the second thing that you said that's wrong. I can give them an update, but in this quote, it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. Then I try to make her feel a little better by giving her an honest, true story. 17, 18 years ago, when I came into Logan, Utah as fire chief, I didn't like the way they had decaled their ambulances because it wasn't what I was used to in California. So being a bull in the china shop and not doing my homework properly, I ordered all the ambulances, all 8 of them, relabeled. It cost $5,000. And then my EMS chief came back from vacation and proceeded to inform me that they had been labeled in accordance with state statute. And they had to be labeled exactly word for word, letter for letter, the exact way it was before I messed it up. So I then had to pay $5,000 to have it undecaled and redecaled back. It was embarrassing, as you might imagine at the time, but it was a very valuable lesson about making sure you've done your homework first and ask the people that are there, the locals that live there, why they do what they do. Because people live and they have a lot of experience, they usually have some pretty good ideas, and there's usually a reason they do it. So this is why we don't want to go too far. The other thing is I don't take jobs unless the organization that's hiring me agrees to my ethical standards. And those are the confidentiality of employees that give me feedback is absolute. And that's not negotiable. You will never hear from me that John Doe said that Bob Smith is a this or that or whatever. Because I want jobs well beyond this town. And I can't do what I do and get to the bottom line truth if people don't feel safe to be honest. The second thing is I have a policy of loyalty to the absent. So I never allow people when I interview them or survey them, I don't allow them to say the fire chief is a jerk or the mayor doesn't know what he's doing or whatever. That's not allowed. When that happens, I stop them in their tracks and I say, if you want to be derogatory towards personalities to individual people, let me know now and we'll stop this interview and I'll call them and invite them in, but they need to be present and you need to be man enough or woman enough to tell it to their face, not behind their back. What you can tell me though is if you think the fire chief, and nobody said the fire chief's a jerk, just for the record, I'm making a point here. If you think the fire chief is a jerk because the training program is inadequate, then let's stay focused on the training program is inadequate. And let's be specific as to what aspects of the training program need repair. So let's focus on solutions and let's focus on the problem, not personalities. So consequently, because of loyalty to the absence, you will have in your report thorough report that talks about behaviors, trends, and issues, but not individual people, okay? And there's some basic study principles that we have to go through. This is part of any organizational development material or procedures that you use. We work from simple to complex, from general to specific. We identify areas of needed improvement, and then we prioritize those needed improvements. And I want to say, how do we prioritize it? When I was in my master's degree program, I had to take statistics. And to let you know how much I was afraid of that class, in high school I had to take algebra twice just to get a B in it, okay? So here I am in statistics, but I remember the instructor started off by writing on the blackboard that anything that can be observed can be measured. And all of a sudden I thought, hey, that's a great concept. And anything that can be observed can be measured. But once we've observed it, and we've identified an index to quantify it, how do we then screen it or filter it for priority? Or in public safety, at least fire service risk management, how do we screen it for criticality? And there's a 3-step criteria I use. And the first is liability or risk. The second is operational effectiveness. And the third is benefit cost analysis, okay? So, while I was here, I was invited by an adjacent fire district, Thomas Creek West, if I would come not at your expense, not on your hours,
Thank you.
for gratis from me, because I like teaching, to teach them a material called the New Science, which has come from the National Institute of Standards and Testing and Underwriters Laboratory on the new science of flow path management and fire behavior. It's all new science, a bunch of PhDs, the guys who got an A in algebra the first time, not the guys like me. And you know, thermocouplings and readings by the thousands and hundreds of test burns they did. And they've changed the art and science of firefighting dramatically and increased safety dramatically. I found out when I got here, not well known in this area, but it's so substantial that you have Lots of liability if you don't know about it, because the courts will tell you if you didn't know about it, you should have known about it. And if you did know about it, you should have adopted it. So, and that will be part of what I'll provide as a separate contract. But anyway, so I went and did this free gratis for them. And in the process of that, I created a situation that I was able to use to explain to Michelle and to the command staff at the fire department, because they were wanting to know, how does this concept of prioritizing or defining criticality work? How do you go from the theoretical to the practical world? When you actually sit down, you figured out all the things that are wrong, and you figured out what you think are the things that are going to fix that the best. How do you determine which ones to use, which solution to use? And how do you determine which way you put it? What gets fixed first, in other words? So I said, well, let me give you an example of this training I did yesterday at Thomas Creek. Didn't cost him anything. He offered me a soda. The chief, Dan, offered me a free soda, but I turned it down. Because my wife gets on my case when I drink too many Diet Cokes, as well as many other things. So it didn't cost them anything, but they have liability and risk. The risk means people could die that wouldn't need to die if they use the correct tactics, based on what we now know. The liability, which is similar to risk but different legally, means it's legal liability. It's when the suits, briefcases get involved. Because there have already been court cases over this new science that has not been adopted, where they've established, because it's been out now for about 8 to 10 years, that it's kind of like a sexual harassment charge. Mary says Bob sexually harassed her. She files a lawsuit. The manager says, I didn't know about it. And lots of case law says, doesn't matter. If you didn't know about it, you should have known about it. And if you did know about it, you should have taken rapid and effective remedial action, right? Well, they use the same standard. Now, all of us operate in government in every state of the union. I'm pretty sure Oregon too. It's intimidating having an attorney here. Hey, turn your chair around and face the window. Anyway, hey, I've got a great attorney joke. Okay, 2 guys are in a bar having a drink. One turns the other. Do you have a sense of humor? Can you handle this? Okay, good. And he says, I'm sorry, but I think all attorneys are jerks. And the other guy looks really offended. He goes, I'm sorry, you just offended me. He goes, why? Are you an attorney? He goes, no, I'm a jerk. Anyway, a friend of mine told me this when she was at a reception with a retired Supreme Court justice who she knew. And this Supreme Court justice told her that joke. So I figured if a Supreme Court justice retired could tell a joke like that, the rest can handle it. Okay, so back to the point here. How do we get this liability? If in sexual harassment, you either knew and should have done something, or you didn't know but you should have known and then done something. Same thing on a lot of these liability issues that come out. In all these states, we have a term that's called a principle, and it's in the statutes, called general government liability immunity, right? Now that's been weakened over the last 2 decades through litigation, especially in the area of EMS. Malpractice goes right against the government almost as fast as it does private sector. But outside of EMS, malpractice, it's still a pretty solid defense. But there's no liability protection, no immunity for gross negligence, just negligence. Now what's the difference between the two? The reason that legislatures all over the country and the federal government have for decades, if not hundreds of years, had general government liability immunity is because we get placed in positions as public employers or public employees where we have to make tough calls. If you're a public works guy and you have a retention dam and you have to decide which levee or which dam gets fixed because you can't fix them both, you have to make the lesser of 2 bad decisions. If I show up as a firefighter and I've got a building burning, and I can't save both houses because I don't have enough resources, and I have to choose between the one on the right or the one on the left, I know that the guy who doesn't get his house protected may sue me if we don't have liability, because he's gonna think I should have done that. In the law enforcement field, one officer pulls up, pulls his weapon, he's got two bad guys, each one with a knife or a gun, to two people. One is a 19-year-old college girl, the other is a 67-year-old bald, overweight guy who's had a chance to live. And that deputy makes a life-critical decision to take out the guy holding the young girl still has a life to live. Now, my wife might actually be quite happy because the life insurance policy would pay out. But if she didn't, she could theoretically, without this, sue and say that you used bad judgment. She was a young girl, yes, that's true, but he was experienced. He had the capacity to make a lot of money, and now I lose that income, right? So, but what is it? It's a judgment call. It could turn out, for example, Jeff, if you in your capacity as a public works guy made a decision to go for this levee and not that dam, and the levee didn't break, but the dam broke, your judgment was wrong, but it wasn't criminal. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't grossly negligent. When you are a public works first responder, a fire service first responder, a law enforcement first responder, the nature of the job is we have to make judgment calls all the time that usually involve the lesser of two evils, or the both are bad choices. You have to make one. And we don't want us afraid to make the decision because we'll get sued. So what is the legal definition between the two? You can be stupid, but you can't be stupid and know you're being stupid, and you do the stupid thing anyway, right? So for example, if I think that this building is on fire and this is the safest place to attack the attic from underneath, and I put the crews in here and the roof collapses, that was just bad judgment. But it wasn't negligent because I didn't know I was making a bad decision. I was making the best decision my training and experience would allow. But if I had a fire officer who came up to me and said, don't put them in there because the roof is sagging, we saw it from on top of the ladder, you're going to kill somebody, and I say, bug off, I'm the chief, I'm going to do it anyway, and then it collapses, that becomes discoverable during the discovery process. Now we cross the line from negligence to gross negligence because you knew that it was unsafe and you did it anyway. So when we're talking about liability and we're talking about risk, we first of all, from a human standpoint, don't want to kill people or injure people needlessly. So we want to reduce risk, but we also want to reduce liability. So Michelle and I were talking about some of the things that we're discovering as we go through this study. I said, now, I will present you a comprehensive report that will give you a definitive checklist of things you need to work on. And they will be screened in the recommendation through those three criteria: liability and risk, operational effectiveness, and cost benefit. And in a perfect world, every recommendation we make meets all three of those criteria, okay? But let's say you never hired me. Let's say you had some issues with your department. Let's say the issues is, or the main issue was they never knew about the new science, so they never trained on it, somebody died from it. And the family of the deceased firefighter now is suing the city for negligence, and they're claiming gross negligence. Their attorney is going to argue, you may not have known about the new science, but if you were a responsible chief doing due diligence, right, you would have been well-read enough and dialed into the industry enough. So it's one of those situations that you didn't know about it, but you should have known about it. Or if you did know about it, but you didn't change your tactics and you're using old tactics in spite of knowing new science, it's even worse. So, for example, teaching our firefighters here about this new science and adapting the tactics to meet that, it reduces risk, right? But it also reduces liability. Now, what about operational effectiveness? If you can put the fire out faster with less property damage, less danger to the victims that may be entrapped therein, and far, far less risk to the firefighters is that operational effectiveness, just by simply changing some tactics. Tactics that don't cost any money to change. Well, the answer is yes. And if you're not Lakeview tonight, but if you were Thomas Creek West Fire District, and you get me to teach that, which I did last night for free, how's the benefit cost ratio on that? It's excellent. It reduces liability, it reduces risk. I'll give you a good rate, by the way, if you hire me. It wouldn't be the consultant rate, it'll be the training officer rate. Okay, so you see how those three interact together? So when we come up with these goals and objectives, not only are we going to throw them out there, because a consultant isn't worth their weight in anything, let alone gold, if all they do is identify a bunch of problems and throw at you expensive fixes that are impractical and financially unfeasible, right? That's just nonsense, right? And if they don't prioritize it for you and they give you a list of 25 things you need to do, you know, if you got 25 priorities, you got none, because you can't do 25 priorities at once. What a consultant needs to do if they're doing their job right, and when I was a chief, and I've been a chief for 22 years in 3 different departments, I required my staff to come to me and meet those 3 tests: liability and risk, operational effectiveness, and benefit cost. And so that's how all of these will be arranged. Now, for 100 hours, you don't get to fix everything. Okay? But there's an old saying, which is very true, that perfection is the enemy of the good. Right? In other words, we don't want to do X, Y, Z until we've got A, B, C perfect. Nobody ever won a war or won the space race or came out with the first real minivan like Chrysler did and made them viable again. Nobody won whatever they're trying to do by getting a perfect product or a perfect solution. They got the first good solution that was adequate. So you don't have enough time, I don't have enough time, and you don't have enough money to fix everything perfectly. But because we can't do everything is not an excuse to do nothing, right? It's not an all or nothing world. And so we won't fix everything, but we will fix lots of things. And they will be beneficial. And all the things that we will fix will meet those 3 criteria: reduce liability and risk, improve operational effectiveness, and also, what was the third one? Going blank here. Benefit cost. Okay, so what's the organizational development process? How do we do that? Well, the first thing is we get tasking identified. We've done that. And then we do data collection, which is just a fancy term for we do employee interviews or surveys, and we're doing surveys that were custom built for this city and for this fire department and dispatch center. We review documentation. The 5-inch binder, 10 of which Michelle has ordered for your edification, will have 4.5 inches of documentation review that is referenced in the remaining 1/2 inch of actual final report. We include all that in your binder so that if you're reading along and it says the 20-factor test used by the IRS that determine if volunteer firefighters are employees or not says X, Y, Z, we want you to be able to go into the attachments at the back and find the 20-factor test without having to get online and search for it, because that's not what you pay us to do. You pay us to tell you what you need to do, why you need to do it, how to do it, and to show you the evidence by which we came to that conclusion. And then on-site inspections and review. Chuck, can I introduce you well enough?
Not at all.
Not at all. I'm sorry, I don't know, I guess when I got to inspection, this is Chuck Burdan. He's my associate. Chuck and I started in the fire service. I started in '71, he started in '73. We were both firefighters at Sac Metro Fire in Sacramento. And I promoted up the line through operations and training, and he promoted up and then eventually went into communications. And Chuck has run a number of world-class large dispatch centers that dispatch 500,000 or 1 million calls a year kind of dispatch centers. He's been on NFPA committees for the last 20 years. Does everybody know what the NFPA is? The National Fire Protection Association. Everything that happens in the fire service is regulated by National Fire Protection Association standards. When you have, for example, in Oregon, we have some statutes that are OSHA generated that are specific to the fire service, and you have to do it exactly the way the statute says. But interestingly enough, 99% of what the Oregon statute says you have to do comes out of NFPA standards. And when they don't have specificity on a given area for the fire service, they say that the prevailing standard of care, so to speak, for the industry will be the NFPA standard applicable to that subject. Well, there's 2 NFPA standards right now for 911 PSAP, primary safety answering point dispatch centers. One is 1061, which is telecommunicator qualifications, dispatcher qualifications, and the other is 1221, which is your physical plant, your technology, your telephone circuits. Do they have redundancy? Do you have backup generators? Do the comm centers have security facilities so people can't break in, take out your dispatch center, and now the whole public safety system is compromised? And he's been on both those committees that promulgated all those regulations for the last 20 years. And now, for the last couple of years and going forward, he is the chairperson for a new standard being developed called 1225, which is going to take those other 2 standards and marry them together in one standard. They'll still have bifurcated subject matter between the telecommunicator qualifications of performance and the physical plant, but it's going to be one standard now, and he chairs that committee. So basically, we benefit by bringing him in. We have, and he's got his master's degree and his bachelor's degree and 40 years experience, plus all this committee work. We literally have here the most qualified and most influential person in the United States that determines what good looks like for all 6,000 PSAP 911 centers in the entire country. He and his influence on that committee will determine the future of what's required. So we brought him in. I know about dispatch centers. I've been on dispatch boards as the chief. But when you start getting into the real technology of it and all that, you need somebody who knows what it is. So whatever he recommends, he knows what he's talking about. So those are the on-site inspections, and that's what we did today. Then the data analysis. I'm in the process of doing that now, which is analyzing the surveys that have come back. And then I contact the people that have sent me surveys when I need clarification and say, well, what do you mean by this? You know, I've got a few that come in and says, your choices are A, B, or C, and they click A, B, and C, and it's like, okay, what are you telling me here? Everything's screwed up, or you didn't understand the question because you were supposed to pick one. See, O-N-E means one, you know? So I get back and we make that work. We look for what we call sentinel issues, and this is what we talked about before, the liability, operational effectiveness, etc. We look at alternative approaches. And that's very closely related to the sentinel issues and the priority factors. Because we look at lots of solutions, but we don't want to get you one that's unrealistic. I mean, I could come in here and say hire 3 times as many firefighters and 2 times as many dispatchers and buy all new apparatus and do this and do that, but is that practical? Is that helpful? It's just unrealistic. And then because we use this interaction, if you will, this synergy between the priority factors and the alternatives that we identify, we're able to come up with the recommendations, and all that's explained. And then we tell you how to execute it. And then you're on your own unless that's another contract. Now, we don't leave you totally hanging with no help, because what we actually do, I said earlier, my undergraduate work was in journalism. And if you go to journalism school, at least back in the 70s, when they actually used to have no offense, but objective journalism, you'd learn how to write a lead paragraph, right? Yeah. And it was very standard. Who, what, when, why, and how, right? Kind of thing. We actually build a matrix that does that. It'll say, what do you need to do? How do we recommend you do it? When do we think is a realistic time frame? Who do we think should be assigned to be accountable for the outcome? And what resources, are you going to need to make this happen? And it'll be in quick little bullet points. And then if you can't sleep at night, you can read the other 40 or 50 pages that will tell you how we got to that. But what this council will get is a document that will say, this is the most critical, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this. And it'll tell you who should do it, when they should do it, how they should do it, et cetera, et cetera. So you can read the executive summary, which is 4 or 5 pages, or you can read the whole thing, which is 50 pages probably without the references, or you can go to the 2 or 3 pages that have those issues there. And that's what I just mentioned there. And they'll be measurable. So remember what I said earlier that I learned in a master's degree program. If it's observable, it can be measured. And so we make sure that we put measurements as to what good looks like. All right. We also use a document called SITSTAT, which comes out of conflagration fire command and control, where you do a situation status report. And so some of the things we've looked at, and we're well through doing this, is finances, including budgets, adequacy versus affordability, 911, compliance with 1061, 1221, reliability and redundancy of equipment, morale, capital improvement plans, finances and proper cost accounting, ISO grading. ISO is the Insurance Services Organization. It's how your fire insurance rates get established. If you have a good fire department with a good grade, you get better fire insurance rates. If you have the opposite, you get higher fire insurance rates. We look at staffing, career, volunteers, compliance with NFPA 1720 and actually 1710 as well, which is a response time and staffing level standard. Leadership effectiveness and morale. We looked at policies and procedures, their adequacy from liability and risks on the fire ground, legal, social issues, safety issues. We've examined every Oregon State OSHA rule we can find on firefighter compliance, and we look at operational effectiveness. We look at fire prevention practices, city ordinances, the Oregon State Fire Code, plans to comply with it, fire investigations, plans to comply with that, and the ISO rating schedule. Yeah. SCBAs, that's breathing apparatus. That's a huge area of risk and liability. So we have to do fit testing, medical screening, training, records, etc. We have to look at PPE, and we're not talking about these things. We're talking about turnouts, firefighting coats, boots, pants, hoods, goggles, gloves, the whole 9 yards. And we have to look at the different skills they do, like tech rescue. It creates lots of legal liability and risk. If, for example, you have a below grade, like a manhole cover, rescue that needs to be done, and your firefighters aren't trained to do it and don't have the right equipment, then it creates one of those really lousy decisions, because you could find a firefighter standing there thinking, here's a utility worker down for the count, but I don't have the right equipment or certification. I'm going to violate OSHA law, and if I get hurt or killed, the city will be liable, but if I stand here, this person's going to die. Do I think I have enough common sense to put on a breathing apparatus, jump down in there, grab that guy and hand him up to my buddy, and get away with it and hope the OSHA inspector never finds out about it? You see, that's a real life, real world potential scenario. So we have to look at what kind of training has been done in a small city like this, a small fire department. Are we putting our firefighters in a position where that's the decision they have to make? And that goes back to that other matrix about benefit, cost, liability and risk, and that whole thing. Some places the sweet spot. In many jurisdictions, the utility, the public works utility, will train their crews to be the initial crew that does it, but they're required to go into confined space to have a backup team. And so what a lot of public utilities or public works organizations will do is they'll go to the fire department and say, if we pay for your training and we buy your equipment for you, will you agree to be our backup team if we get an incident? We'll go in first because we'll train our people how to make immediate rescues, but we'll then have to call 911, have you respond, and that's usually a solution. So as we discover, we haven't gotten to that point yet, whether that capability needs to be here and is here, that may be the kind of solution we have. The other thing that you see there is ICS, NIMS, Fireground Accountability, and RIT. ICS is the Incident Command System. NIMS is the National Incident Management System. After 9/11, the fire service invented Incident Command. Law enforcement couldn't spell Incident Command up until 20 years ago. Why? Because the fire service had these California fires where in one afternoon they'd burn 3,000 homes up and they'd have to move 500 engine companies in to deal with the emergency. How do you manage 500 engine companies and 2,000 firefighters and do it quickly? So they developed a process called FireScope in California that developed the initial incident command system and was adopted nationwide by the fire service 30 years ago. After 9/11, because New York City Police Department doesn't play, or didn't at the time, play nice with the fire department in the sandbox. In fact, the New York City Police Department labeled themselves, and by the way, they copyrighted and trademarked it. What? What's the acronym for? NYPD, right? Well, the fire department said, well, we can't have cops doing that. We got to have our own trademark acronym, but we'll be darned if we're going to go NYFD. So they went ahead and trademarked FDNY. So instead of being New York Fire Department or New York Police Department like that, they're not New York Fire Department, they're the Fire Department of New York. It's cops and firefighters. So the cops had their incident command post and the fire guys had their incident command post on 9/11. And there wasn't a lot of good communications. The radios were not interoperable. There was a lot of problems. So after this happened, they got a bunch of people together and they said, how can we fix this? And they said, there's already a system in place. It's called the incident management system, but it was built around firefighting. So what we need to do is we need to expand it out so it covers all disciplines. And now, as you know, public works directors have to be trained in national incident management, police officers do, depending on where you're at in the organization, there's different levels of training. So we look at NIMS and ICS because that's a very large liability and risk, and it's a very large operational effective, and it's not very expensive to comply with. Turns out your fire department has got a lot of that in place already. The next one is fireground accountability. Because of 9/11, when they had hundreds, I think they lost 78 law enforcement officers and 343 firefighters when the towers collapsed. And it took them weeks to figure out who was in there and who was dead and who was not, who was on vacation. So what came out of that is they had every agency that sends personnel into what's called an IDLH environment, which is immediately dangerous to life and health, has to have a fireground or an incident, in the case of other accountability system. And so for firefighters, basically they all have these little plastic Velcro tabs under their helmets with their names on it. And you always have to have an incident commander on every incident. You have to have an accountability officer. And everybody that goes to anywhere into an IDLH environment has to give their tags to the accountability officer, who then puts it on a control board that shows exactly where they're at in the fireground. So if suddenly you have a structural collapse on the east wing of a school fire, they can look at that board and say, we have 7 people in here and here are their names. So you know right where you need to go and you know who you're looking for. Well, in addition to that, you have RIT, which is Rapid Intervention Team. On every IDLH environment, whether it's a confined space or a working structure fire, if you send people into the IDLH environment by both OSHA law in Oregon as well as federal OSHA and prevailing standards, NFPA standards and everything else, you have to have ICS, accountability, and RID in place. And RID has to be a team that's fully suited in an entire structural firefighting ensemble with SCBA and mask, everything ready to go. They have a charged hose line, they have rescue tools, they have a buddy rescue breathing apparatus, SCBA. It's a separate tank that they can go in and locate a downed firefighter who's running short on air. And this tank is a special device that is configured that can plug into their existing breathing apparatus and begin transferring air from this reserve tank into the tank that's either run out or about to run out of air. If you don't have all three of those in place and you lose a firefighter in an IDLH environment, and you want to spend another couple of $100 and have your legal counsel who knows the law, but doesn't necessarily know fire service case law, and he calls me, I would just say, your issue is not whether you're going to be writing a check. The issue is whether, how many zeros are going to be behind the check, and the other issue is whether the mayor and the town manager and the fire chief are going to be criminally charged for criminal negligence, because these are not forgivable. Not forgivable in Oregon state law, not forgivable in federal law. Okay, and you can be taken to both courts because you're violating both state and federal law. They usually don't do that. If the state's going to beat somebody up and put them in prison for 5 years for being criminally negligent, the Fed will usually let that go. But it's not where you want to be.
Mark, I have a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I don't know if it's dumb or not, but,
Never done.
now, does that go for the same as volunteer firefighters as
Yes,
well?
absolutely.
All firefighters, okay.
Yeah, that's another whole issue, but one of the problems is staffing, right? Because you can only afford so many paid firefighters
Right.
in a small jurisdiction like this. In 1998, the U.S. Fire Administration issued a 100-page white paper called Difficulties of Recruiting and Retaining Volunteer Firefighters in the American Fire Service. That was updated 10 years later in 2008 with a revision, and it didn't get any better. And now we're, 12 years beyond that, and it's just as bad. There's all kinds of societal forces that are making it difficult to recruit and retain volunteer firefighters. And we don't have time to go into that, that's another discussion. But what we do have time to say is one of the factors that makes it difficult is the training and liability standards, both in Oregon state law and federal law, are identical for career firefighters as they are for volunteer firefighters. So to send a volunteer firefighter into a burning structure or onto a wildland fire up in the hills, or into a manhole cover, or to a hazardous material spill, that volunteer firefighter has to have the exact same number of hours of training and certifications as a career firefighter. So when I started as a volunteer in 1971 for Sac Metro, it was kind of like, this is how we rolled hose, this is how we spread salvage covers, this is how we hold the hose, and this is how you open the nozzle. And you learned it over a period of a couple of months of coming to drill, and then the rest was on the job training, right? No more. It's hundreds of hours of training to get certified just to be an entry-level firefighter without having to have a firefighter one certified person with you. And it's additional hundreds of hours of training to drive and operate pumpers, aerial ladders, to go on hazmat calls, to detect rescue, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem we're having, and I was almost late getting here. My dear friend was, I think, stroking out because I was getting emails saying, it's starting, where are you? But I was at the station meeting with training people on some of the solutions we're finding, because how do you keep these volunteers trained when it's not their career? They have other jobs. And if you make it too onerous, what happens? They just say, I can't do it. The price of admission is too high, and they leave. And eventually, if they all leave, then you can't fight a fire with one guy on a truck. And that means everybody's taxes go up because you have to triple or quadruple the size of the fire department with paid personnel. So it's in our interest to figure out this problem and solve it. And we're going to do it with technology. There's some really great programs that allow these volunteers to sit at home in their lock and loads. Everybody know what a lock and load is? It's the fire service term for a recliner chair. By the way, just a fun fact, when I was the assistant chief for operations at Sac Metro, we bought about 300 or 400 Bakken loads every couple of years because we had 44 stations we had to put them in. And firefighters are really tough on furniture. And so one day I was talking to a representative from Lazy Boy, and he said, the fire service is the largest purchaser of recliner chairs of any segment of the economy throughout the United States. And I said, well, in one sense that's interesting, but it doesn't convey a very good message about fireground or firefighter productivity during the daytime, does it? But anyway, that's another whole thing. Okay, so then training, there's a thing called DPSST. Sheriff, you know what that's all about, don't you?
Yes,
That's
sir.
the State Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. And basically, if you're gonna be a certified, post-certified police officer, law enforcement officer, you have to be certified by them. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Yes, sir.
And the same thing for firefighters. It doesn't matter whether you're a volunteer firefighter. If you're gonna enter an IDLH environment, you have to have entry level first, and that's a certification that takes about 65 hours of training. Firefighter 1 takes about 400 hours of training. Driver, pumper, operator, and then it just adds up. So by the time you get down, firefighter 2, fire officer, and all these could be volunteers, there's 500 or 600 hours of training in there. Okay, all done through DPSST up in Salem. You've been up and seen their training facility, their fire training facility at the buildings and all. That's pretty cool stuff, isn't it? It's Disneyland for firefighters. Okay, and then you have to have training records. Well, there are new digital solutions that are out there now. And one of them that I'm going to, that I'll give you a little bit of a preliminary finding is I'm going to recommend you find a good digital training program, probably Target Solutions, because I'm familiar with that. We use that in North Bend, because you have to have a certain number of classroom hours, and you have to have, and that's called didactic training, and you have to have a certain number of out in the field hours, which is known as manipulative training. But it's about 3 to 1, 3 hours of classroom time for 1 hour out in the field. And you get volunteers who come in and they come and go and they come and go and they come and go, and you have to hold academies and they don't show up because you can't make them show up, they're volunteers. Well, all of this now has been digitized in these interactive programs. It'll cost you a couple of $1,000 a year. It's the cheapest money you'll ever spend. It's like 1 weekend of his time in here on a lawsuit. And what happens is everything is loaded into this program depending on which modules you buy. And it's all maintained up to date. Those NFPA standards, they're joined by another organization called IFSTA, which is the International Fire Service Training Association. And every training manual in the United States is developed and promulgated by IFSTA. And IFSTA and NFPA kind of work hand in hand. They quote each other and reference each other. Everything in Target Solutions is cross-pollinated back to NFPA standards and IFSTA standards. And so in the old days, when I was a chief before we had this digital technology, it would cost me about $3,000 to buy the entire, one manual of the entire 300 manual IFSTA library. And then after 5 or 6 years, it was out of date because they would update it constantly. So we'd take and throw all of those into a dumpster and we buy all new. Well, now what happens is you contract with these guys. They have everything from entry level to firefighter 1, driver, pumper, aerial, hazmat, body substance isolation training, tech rescue, everything. And it's updated as the changes. As NFPA committees like Chuck runs, comes out with new standards, they immediately take it and upgrade their curriculum to meet the new standard. When IFSTA comes out with the new Essentials of Firefighting Manual on how you raise ladders or spread salvage covers, or tactics and strategy using the new science, they automatically update the curriculum. So when these volunteers now are given a drill schedule that says you have to do X, Y, Z in this amount of time, they can sit at home, pull out their smartphone, bring it up, and while they're sitting in the lock and load at home, it's interactive. And it comes in modules, 30-minute modules, hour modules, and they give tests as you go through it. And as you go through each module and you answer the questions, if you don't get a passing score, they make you go through the module again. You do it again, you get a passing score, they take you to the next module. When you're done with that thing, they say, congratulations, you're now certified as meeting this standard for this time frame, and it automatically sends a report to the training officer for the fire department, and it goes into a digital training file in the name of the city or town of Lakeview. The firefighter John Doe or Mary Smith has met all the requirements for refresher training for operations level hazmat responder, for example. And so all of a sudden now, all of the classroom work can be done digitally from their home. They don't even have to come into the fire station. So the result of that is, because I sat down today and I went through with your chief and training officer the 350 hours of training that need to happen a year to meet all the federal and state requirements. That's an hour almost every day for volunteer firefighters. Well, you can't have them come into the station every day and do training. So they can just literally sit down and bring it up and do the deal, and they're getting 2/3 of that. So the time that's left and remaining is the stuff where they actually pull hose, raise ladders, spread salvage covers, do manipulative stuff, and that's kind of fun. They like doing that kind of stuff. They don't want to sit in a classroom and listen to somebody read out of an manual. So that's what we're working on, and we're trying to fix some problems that we've uncovered. For example, the insurance service rating for this town is a class 4 in your urban area, and I think it was an 8. It's an 8 out in the rural areas. You have up to 100 points you can get under the ISO grading schedule, and 60 to 70 is a class 4, and you had 68.8. You were 1.2 points short of a class 4 becoming a class 3, which on an average 2,500 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house would have dropped insurance rates by an average across all the different insurance companies by about $125 a year in their annual fire insurance rate, just by going from a 4 to
They rate that on response time, correct?
Oh, it's much more complicated than that. Lots of guys that got A's in calculus and trigonometry develop these very complex. Chuck could probably understand it. I can't.
But I got into it with our insurance agent here a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's very.
And you pay less in Ben than you do here,
Mhm.
and then our response time is better than Ben.
Right, but you see, they break it down in 3 general categories. One is communications, dispatch. One is the fire department. Are you the water purveyor for your town?
Social distancing.
I held my breath. Their water system is incredibly, I know it's got a color to it, and you got a grant you're getting, and every time I look in the toilet at Best Western, I think I forgot to flush it. Okay, but it's not dangerous to drink, and the fire doesn't care. And they do such a good job in their maintenance program that you got almost 100% of the available points, and the points for the water system alone is 40% of the ISO grading.
Mhm.
The fire department itself is 50%, and then the communications center is 10%. Well, when you look into the training aspect, okay, out of the 50 points, 9 of them, out of the 50 points that is attributed to the fire department, 9 of them are training. And you only got like 2.5 points of the 9 points, okay? So, for example, just that digital program is one of the major deficits identified in the ISO report. And by the way, the reason I blew through that 800 hours or 100 hours is I've read over 500-600 pages of back documents on this. They really slammed you for not getting enough hours in for firefighters. And it goes back to what I explained earlier about how do you expect volunteer firefighters to put in 300 hours a year? You don't have to get 300. It's not an all or nothing. It's a graded or graduated scale. So if you're supposed to do 300, but you can't do remember what I said earlier? Because you can't do everything doesn't mean you do nothing, right? So you can't do 300, but you don't need to only do 40 either. Maybe with this digital technology, you could do 200. And I've looked at and done the analysis. There's about a half a dozen ways of improving some things in training, which you're going to get in the report. It's going to cost you a little money. And I'm not referring to my bill. I'm talking about to fix the training problems. But if you use just a couple of those things, you can request a regrading for just the training segment of it. And I think you're going to be able to knock it down to a 3. And every single property owner in this city that pays fire insurance rates will probably have a reduction of over $100 just from going from a 4 to a 3. I mean, I can't say for sure because it's independent to each individual insurance company and what their loss is for this zone, and it gets very complicated. But that entire report from ISO and some of my scribbling math in there, and if you figure out I didn't do it right, forgive me because I confessed my algebra skills were pretty poor. But that will be part of what's in that reference material for you. And then finally, the new science, which is what I taught to your sister fire department across to the west. And I've already made plans to come back and train your fire department in that here with your chief. And that's the new science, flow path management. SLICER RS is another acronym that is tactical in nature. And we're going to look at apparatus, equipment, ages, type, mileage, pump hours, relative condition, maintenance records, schedules, hose testing, aerial and ground letter testing. Some of that's we've already looked at is good, but the training's not. And a replacement master plan. Now, while I have you here, I want to educate you a little bit. You've already signed a contract, so I get paid whether you like me or not. And you're my 3rd or 4th city council I've given this little speech to. When I became chief in Logan, Utah, all of their fire apparatus was 30 or 40 years old and was breaking down. We talk about liability and risk. We knew it was old, we knew it was broken, we knew it was unreliable, and we weren't replacing it, and it was breaking down as they were pulling in front of a burning house with a child in the back bedroom needing rescue and we couldn't get water. What's your liability there, right? So I brought that to the city council's attention. We did some research on it. We went back through the minutes and we found that for the last 30 or 40 years, every single successive council and councilors and mayors that were there, who all wanted to get reelected, wanted to do it. Now remember, this was Logan, Utah, which is pretty conservative, especially when it comes to taxes. And so their whole campaign thing was, I saved you money. We didn't buy those expensive fire trucks. And we kept your taxes low. Right. And within a year of me being fire chief, they had to spend $4 million to buy new pumpers, new aerial ladder, new ambulances, new brush trucks, etc. So what happened was these other councils kicked the can down the road until the poor city council and mayor, who happened to be the ones left standing when the music ended and there was no chair left, they got the bill and they had to raise taxes substantially and take care of the problem. And after that, they got a apparatus master plan replacement, so they'd never get another balloon payment like that again. When I went to North Bend on the coast, Coos Bay area, found the same thing. And the greatest need is we need to get a new engine right away, so that cost them $400,000. City council funded that. But also, I gave them an apparatus replacement master plan. And I introduced them to the concept of lease purchasing, because right now, for public sector entities, you can borrow money to buy apparatus that your money that you're borrowing is so cheap, it's almost not costing you anything. And you can put it on like a 7-year lease purchase plan. And what you do is you work out a replacement schedule that has everything being replaced at certain intervals that are matched to your town's need. You don't have to replace apparatus here at the same rate you do in Sacramento, where an engine company runs on 8,000 medical calls a year. When your frontline engineer is running on 100 calls a year, maybe?
Maybe at the most.
Okay, right? Because it matters, doesn't it? So You build a plan that's specific to your situation, and then you build in a certain dollar amount. And when you do that, what you basically do is you commit the organization to take some money and put it away. When you're buying an apparatus, you're making lease payments till it's totally purchased. And if you're doing it right, if you build it correctly, then the lease runs out and it's purchased, and there's a period of time between that purchase and when the next apparatus is due for replacement. But the council continues to make the same investment into a capital improvement fund, which is blessed and sanctified by the council to not be touchable for anything short of the dam breaking and, and a lot of councils say, well, we don't want to be committed. Well, you're committed until you have a financial emergency, and then you're one council resolution away from changing that. So you never lose the ability to go in and get that money. But it's kind of like impulsive spending protection. It requires the council to pass a resolution to undo what they did earlier. So it doesn't make it convenient to just rush out and borrow money all the time from these other accounts and then kick the can down the line, okay? Now for North Bend, it was $50,000 a year, okay? $50,000 a year for 7 years, plus the down payment they paid for the new engine, which it's almost paid for now. And they'll put $50,000 a year into there, and then after 8 or 9 years, there'll be a large nest egg, which will make a large down payment, and then that, but by the way, it's indexed to 3% per year for inflation. But anyway, it's a plan that we projected out for 65 years. And the council agreed with me that none of us cared about what happened after 65 years. That was some future generation's problem. But as long as they keep doing what they're doing, no city council is going to be caught with a balloon payment for the next 65 years. Now, there's one other thing from a political standpoint. When you do lease purchasing and you have a master plan where you put a certain amount of money into it, what you're doing is you're making sure that your electorate, your people, your taxpayers are paying equally for that protection. In a small town like this, you probably don't have the turnover in terms of people moving in and moving out that you would in a larger metropolitan area. But we're a much more mobile society than we used to be. So take, for example, Logan. In that year or two where they had to come up with $4 million, okay, and they borrowed it from their wastewater enterprise fund and things like that. If I moved to Logan during that 4 years that they found that money, I had to pay all the taxes for all the apparatus that all those people 30 years before me and now 30 years after me don't have to pay for, right? So I got screwed, okay? On the other hand, all these other people lived and got off scot-free. So what happens from a fairness standpoint, an equity standpoint in the political realm is, when you get these replacement plans, and by the way, these should exist for public works, they should exist for the fire department, for dispatch, for anything that is capital intensive, okay? If I need to buy some new hose, I can do that for a couple of $1,000. If I need to buy you a new engine, you need to give me $500,000. And if your aerial ladder needs replacement, I need $1 million. So these are big ticket items. So you want to have those built into your system because you want to know what is the true cost of government. And you want that cost to be spread out over all of the people who benefit from that value over the years. And you don't want to be a person on a political council that kicks the can down the line just so you can get reelected. Now, I'm sure that doesn't happen here with your town. I spent some time with all three of you, and I know that wouldn't be the case. I know this is hard to imagine, but there are places in America where that kind of politics plays out. And it's generally larger cities than small cities. Because the larger you get, well, I don't know, maybe it's all politics and everybody. But anyway, you understand the concept. So replacement master plan. We won't do the master plan for you under this contract. That would be another contract. But we will make the point and tell you how to do it and flush out the details. Same thing with facilities. Age, relative condition, preventative maintenance, safety inspections. You have to actually have station anti-contamination procedures in place and the community water system. And I was so glad to read that ISO report. Would you please convey to your people that This fire chief thinks you guys walk on water.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's a big deal. You know, you can buy fire trucks and hire more firefighters, but replace all of your water mains. How expensive is that? Okay, it's a big deal. You're about to find out, aren't you? Okay. PPE, structured wildland, you have to do surveys. Every year, a qualified inspector has to inspect every single piece of protective clothing, boots, pants, goggles, helmet, etc. Very few people know that, but if somebody dies in a fire and they attribute it back to flawed personal protective equipment, that's going to be one of those things where the attorney's going to have to tell you how many zeros to be prepared to what. So we want to do those things proactively. It costs almost nothing to do it. The fire chief can become that inspector by getting online for an hour and taking one of those digital classes. So all those kind of things, safety inspections, turnouts, the personal protective equipment. When I started in the fire department in '71, I had to buy my own turnouts. It's against federal law and state law to allow your people to buy their own turnouts. You have to pay for them. And the volunteer association can't pay for them either. The volunteer association could donate a check to the city, which would then put it in the bank, but you're required to purchase the turnouts and provide them to your personnel. It has to come from you by statute. Okay. Public education. Any of you gone on to the website for the city? How would you rate it? How about you? Have you seen it?
Me?
Yeah, any of you? Okay. Then go to Amazon's website and see how user-friendly that is and how much information you can get. Now, we don't have Jeff Bezos' $136 billion. That's that benefit cost thing. But you are a small town with people that need to know how to keep themselves safe, right? Same thing with law enforcement, and you can do it digitally through your website for very little money. Yes, it costs some money to hire somebody who knows more about computers than I do to get it set up, but once you have it set up, you got everything in there. All somebody has to do is go in and say, hey, I need to know how to do exit drills in the home for my little children, right? We've got a little kid that's playing with matches, and I'm afraid they're going to end up in the law enforcement realm of the world. How do we deal with juvenile fire setter programs and that kind of thing? And it's all there. And it's just click, 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 and they go and they get everything they need. No more do you have to buy thousands of dollars worth of NFPA and Fire Administration pamphlets. They go there, it's digital, they click on it, they download it, print it off, they've got everything they need. So those are some of the kinds of things. Training of law enforcement personnel on flow path management. Eventually, are you the sheriff here in this town?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Eventually, the fire department is going to come to you and ask for your cooperation to train your deputies. And it's not a long training, it's like 30 minutes on flow path management. And what they've discovered is a lot of things about what happens when you open a building up before you're ready to put water on the fire, and how that increases the intensity of fire and spreads the fire and actually endangers any victims that are trapped inside. So in most fire departments, including the ones I've been fire chief, we now have agreements with the local law enforcement where we teach their officers. The officers typically want to kick a door in or bust it in with a sledgehammer and yell, is anybody in here, does anybody need to be rescued? And we want them to do that if they get there first, and they usually do. Because they might be able to make a rescue. They might not, but they might be able to. But what we want them to do is understand flow path management, close the door afterwards. So we'd rather have them kick a door in than break a window out if the situation will allow them to do that, because they can close the door, they can't break the window. So once you yell, is anybody in here, and it's either too smoky to go in or nobody answers, you just close the door and wait for the fire department to get there. So that's one of the things that we will be recommending is training for law enforcement officers, so they understand that. We have some great video. YouTube is a wonderful thing most of the time. Okay, we're almost there. Morale. Mayor, you're a firefighter. Scott, you're a firefighter.
Not here.
Used to be.
Yeah.
What's your gut feeling on morale right now in the fire department?
I think it's low.
How about you? Okay. Well, we've only got 25% of the surveys back. I've got more back, but only 25 have been analyzed so far. But so far, there is a morale problem here. What do you think the number one cause of that morale problem is?
Lack of training.
Lack of training. Which is actually a good thing, because fixing water systems is expensive. But fixing training could be a couple of $1,000 and reduce your liability and improve your morale in one fell swoop. And that's why you pay me what you pay me, is to find out where the low-hanging fruit is, and that's what we're discovering. Interestingly enough, relationships between the career firefighters and the volunteers is coming out to be very good. You don't have a problem there. In most combination departments I've either worked in or done analysis for, there's a social conflict construct that's in place between the career and the volunteers, and it's very problematic to change. This town has good relations between their volunteers and their paid, so that's good, because that's not easily fixed if it's the opposite. Let's see, what about relationships between the fire department, dispatch, and city hall? You want to take a guess on that? I'm not going to put you on the spot if you don't want to answer. It's all right. You're the ones writing the checks.
I think it's so-so.
Okay, and we want to be loyal to the absent, don't we? Right? We'll just say that the issues that we're dealing with were not issues that have developed under your new town manager. In fact, she is being perceived as a force for good and offering hope and optimism, okay? But there was some trust issues that we're going to have to be working over the next number of months to overcome. But I think we're on the right track. We had a very good meeting, would you agree, Chuck, today with all the paid dispatchers?
Very much so.
And when we started the meeting this morning, I couldn't get some of them to even look at me. They were so angry and so filled with frustration. And by the time we were done, because you came over by that time, everybody was hugging each other and smiling and saying, we just feel really good about where we're going. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah.
So we're on the right track fixing some of these situations. ISO. The good news I already told you, you got a really good rating. A class 4 is very good for an apartment like this. The downside is you missed a class 3 by that much, and it was training that did it to you. So if we fix the training, we lower the liability and the risk, and we very likely save every one of your property owners that have fire insurance a significant amount of money. I mean, $100 isn't going to take them to, Disney World, but $100 is a couple of movies and a dinner out, right? Yes?
How often can that ISO rating change?
Normally ISO tries to come in every 10 years. Sometimes they get backlogged to every 15 years, but you can always request a regrading of an individual component. And the rules are, if you request a regrading of just your training score, they can't come in and do everything else. It's not like in court, opening up the door, okay? So if you call and say, we'd like you to come in and reevaluate these changes only, they can't even go to other areas within training that you don't invite them to. They have to wait for their regular scheduled regrading. But you can say, we want you to come in and look at our training hours and our training facilities and this, that, or the other thing. And they can come in and see if that will add enough points, they could change and drop you. And that happens fairly often, so that's possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And you've talked to Dennis about this?
Oh, yeah.
Good.
Dennis is excited about everything. Had a good meeting with him today.
Good.
Really good. And one of your deputies, who's one of our training officers, Dustin. Dustin,
He was
Right.
there
he was there.
without my approval?
Talk to him.
No, Daniel
Daniel's a
is the
good guy
deputy
too.
also, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, Daniel's the one who got me free last night, when normally it would be well in excess of 100 an hour, so.
He's a good man.
He's a good man. Yes, he did offer me a soda, but like I said, I turned it down. Okay, mutual aid, automatic aid, we have those agreements in place. The only place we're finding we need a little bit of improvement on is the execution of those agreements in terms of training together and things like that. But we'll work through them. Now, SOPs and SOGs, standard operating procedures, and personnel manuals and such. Good news, bad news. I'll give you the good news first. Your town has excellent employee handbook and excellent standard operating guidelines and policies for the fire department. They are outstanding. Well written, and I know because I've written hundreds of standard operating procedures. What's the bad news? In the surveys, many employees aren't even aware these documents exist and haven't been trained on them. Okay? Now, if I had to choose which problem do we have to fix, it's much easier to fix what you've got than to have to build and create all those other things from scratch. And these have been so well written, believe me, I understand I teased you about being an attorney, but trust me, you would love these documents because they are well written. And I got a master's degree in human resource management. I understand what you have to say to protect yourself against this, that, and the next thing. And they're well written. And I was very pleased to see that. Although it did mean one more contract I probably wouldn't get. So there you go. Okay. But how do you fix that? Because that was one of the things we discussed today.
Good.
It's easy. You go in there and you say, okay, you put it all digitally online. Easy to do, right?
No signal.
It probably just ran out of, it's telling me it's time to quit, probably.
Yeah, it is.
But anyway, to finish this up, you put it online, you make it digital, it's available, and everybody can log in and gain access to it. And because they don't have a good track record of making this information available to everybody, what you're going to do is you're going to put out a requirement that they have a certain time parameter that they have to read both documents and sign an affidavit that they've read it and understood it, and that if they've had questions or didn't understand the issues, they're going to come to their supervisors for clarification. And look, I read all 106 pages of the standard operating guidelines and fire department policies in about 2 hours. And I've spent about an hour and I'm through a third of your town's employee deal. So it's 4 to 5 hours of reading for your members, but you have to do it. They have to be aware of it, okay? Now, once that happens and you have that affidavit signed, it goes into the personnel file because that's your get out of jail card, okay? Then the case law is such that once you've done that, when new people come in, one of the orientation things they have to do is, and I'm going to recommend you no longer give each employee their own copy, and you'll need to sign off on that, counselor, because it's too hard to maintain 100 copies of these things all over the place. And all that has to happen is you don't track down one of those manuals and it doesn't get updated with the new writ tactics and strategy, and somebody shows that it wasn't updated and you're really in trouble. So what you do is you put a couple in the fire station and a couple in dispatch, and for your rest of your departments, like on the employee handbook, you put a couple in public places where they can get to them. And then once a year, after everybody has read them entirely and signed the affidavit, and this should happen for all the employees, and that affidavit is in the personnel file, then it's easy. What you do is you have your command staff in the case of fire, or your senior staff in case of public works or whatever. You have them go through and just identify the highlights using that same criteria that I put up there. Liability and risk, operational effectiveness, and benefit cost. There may be a standard operating guideline that tells you that when you change the toilet paper in the fire station bathroom, and by the way, this is true because it's actually patented, the toilet paper is supposed to roll off the top of it, not the back of it, where it's too far or too close against the wall and you can't reach it conveniently. That's actually by federal statute. Toilet paper rolls are supposed to roll off the top. Totally useless information, but you didn't pay for it, so there you go. Okay, all right. Who cares? That's not gonna put you in court. That's not gonna make him lose sleep. But some of these other things, that have that high criticality of risk and stuff. So what you do is you get them all to read it, sign the affidavit. You get the new people to come in, read it. sign the affidavit and in your file cabinet, right? And then, once a year, and you don't even have to do it again and again, you just have your guys sit down and identify those critical 10 or 15 points you wanna hit on. These are the ones that are gonna cost us money if it doesn't go well. And you bring them in, you put it on the board, and you say, let's go over personal protective equipment on structure fires. Let's go over entry into a confined space without having, you go through the critical things. And after that, the name's on a drill record, that drill record goes into the training file. Ain't a problem, because you have all the others. So you'll have a situation you can take care of that way. Okay. Questions time. Any questions from any of the council or?
No, I think we're headed in the right direction.
Very detailed, and I apologize.
No, I think we're headed in, a lot of this you and I talked about, and I think we're headed in the right direction with it. So,
Well, to your credit, you're spending a significant amount of money. It's not tens and tens of thousands of dollars, but it is thousands of dollars. And I honestly believe that you're doing something that really will have a positive effect for generations to come.
well, not only the fire department, but for the whole town of Lakeview.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank,
And I got to
okay,
play with the state law here.
the last item on the new business is Sheriff Taylor, the 4th deputy. We've got the funding for that, so we need to give the sheriff permission to go ahead and hire.
I make the motion that we allowing sheriff to hire one additional deputy as per a contract with the Lake County Sheriff's Department.
And second it?
Motion made and second, those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay,
Thank you so
anybody
much.
have anything else?
Dinner's on me.
Where are you going?
All right,
Eagle's Nest?
we will adjourn at 5:42.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for coming.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you, sir.